For the past month, I've been talking about where we encounter God. Most of us are familiar with God found in the beauty of nature or the experience of God at church or through prayer. We might sense God in the laughter of children or in the fellowship of like-minded people of faith. But there are other places we encounter God, unlikely places to the way of thinking of many people. For instance, we may encounter God in our struggles, whether they are the ongoing everyday struggles of life or a sudden crisis that may arise. These struggles inevitably give rise to why questions about life's hardships. And as we struggle with God, we come to know God more intimately in ways we never did before. We also encounter God in the silence that washes over us as we allow our thoughts and emotions to drift away. Or we may be surprised by an encounter with God in the outsider, those who are marginalized by society or those we ourselves have pushed to the margins. Last week I talked about an encounter with the God of justice working through transgressors who practice civil disobedience in their refusal to obey unjust laws. And today I'll be concluding this series of sermons with my reflections of God who is always, always found in the cry of the oppressed. Our story opens with the fugitive Moses, who is in hiding from the Egyptian authorities for the murder of an Egyptian. When Moses saw a fellow Israelite being beaten by an Egyptian overlord, he lost his mind. And in a moment of passion, he killed the overlord. Now he is living as a shepherd in the land of Midian. It's a good life, a life of peace and quietness. And this morning we find him hanging out with his sheep on the backside of the desert, in the words of the King James translation, when he hears God speaking to him from a nearby burning bush. A voice that says, "I have seen the affliction of my people, I have heard their cries, and I have felt their sufferings." Sometimes when you and I see the oppressed and hear their cries, we switch the channel or quickly scroll past the article because it's just too much. But God goes further in feeling the suffering of the oppressed. God goes where many of us dare not go. God literally suffers with God's own overburdened children. God suffers with them when you and I don't or won't. Theologian and Old Testament scholar Ellen Davis says, God calls out to Moses as one calling for help. God is calling Moses to help carry the load of human suffering, the suffering of the oppressed. And retired United Methodist minister Steve Garnaas Holmes writes, God is opposed to all injustice and oppression, but God doesn't end it. That's our job. God's gift of freedom for us calls us to work for freedom for others, for social injustice and oppression. We don't wait for God to intervene, Steve writes. We are God's intervention. God was putting out a help wanted sign when Moses was called to address the suffering of the people of Israel. But Moses wasn't too keen on the idea. In this morning's reading, he explains that he's not qualified for the job, not good enough to stand before Pharaoh or to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt. He goes on to say that he doesn't have all the answers if, for instance, they ask who sent him. When these excuses don't fly with God, Moses tells God in the next chapter that people won't believe him, that he's not a good speaker, and that God needs to find someone else to do the job. Moses had seen the affliction of his people in the form of their enslavement. He had heard their cries as the lash of the whip peeled the skin from their backs. And he had even felt their suffering to the extent that it drove him to murder. But unwilling to suffer for long, he changed the channel by making his exit to the land of Midian. And that worked fine until God chased him down and reminded him of the still suffering people whom he had abandoned. When he could take it no longer, he resolved to begin making preparations for the task God had set before him. Moses isn't very impressive in this account of his call to lead the people out of Egypt. I prefer a more inspiring role model than Moses, maybe a larger-than-life superhero. But those aren't the kinds of folks that God typically uses to get the job done. As I look back on my years prior to serving as a minister, I also saw the affliction of my people. I watched as the government refused to address the AIDS health crisis because it seemed to only be affecting prostitutes, needle junkies, and gay men. It wasn't until the infection spread into the heterosexual population that any measures were taken. And by that time, it was too late. I heard the outcry of my people as stories of anti-LGBTQ violence began to make headlines, until the country rallied around the horrific crucifixion of Matthew Shepard. The brutality of the death, combined with his all-American pretty white boy next door good looks, got the attention of Americans. But by that time, it was too late. I felt the suffering of my people when I found myself on the phone one day trying to talk a friend down from blowing his brains out because he had given up trying to resolve his sexuality with his spirituality. He hung up on me, and the police arrived too late. And when I realized that the church and the government no longer had to target the LGBTQ people because now we were killing ourselves, that's when I decided this shit has got to stop. And the real tragedy is that many people are more concerned that I said shit from the pulpit than they are over the LGBTQ blood on the hands of politicians and preachers who make their career out of spewing forth hate. When I began to suffer with my people, instead of turning away from them, I was no longer able to use the excuses that had worked so well in the past. But I'm not trained to be a minister, God. Then get the training. But I'm not a good speaker, God. I don't need an eloquent speaker. I need someone willing to speak truth to power. But I'm afraid of standing in front of people, God. You have nothing to fear. I'll be right by your side. You'll never be alone. Yes, Moses is probably the right role model for me. And maybe he is for you too. Maybe you know a thing or two about resisting the call of God. Maybe you've seen the affliction of the refugee seeking asylum whom our government has caged like an animal. I know I have. Or maybe you've heard the heartbreaking cries of black mothers whose children have been gunned down. I have until I wished I hadn't. And maybe you've done everything you can to avoid the suffering of the hungry and homeless person walking up to the church, rushing to your car to leave instead of engaging that person in conversation. I'm ashamed to say that I've done this too. I've become quite skilled at stopping my ears to the voice of God who spoke to Moses. Now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And when I do, when I cover my ears and avert my eyes, I miss a chance to experience God working in me and through me. I turn my back not only on the oppressed person I encounter, but on God too. Because remember, God is always, always found in the cry of the oppressed. And friends, you and I are always, always called to liberate them, regardless of the reasons we give for not being the right person for the job. So today, let's let go of our excuses and let's heed the call of God to liberate others from that which imprisons them. This time, let's not scroll past the image of injustice on our timeline. Let's not stop our ears to the cries of the oppressed. And let's breathe in their suffering for just long enough to feel our hearts break open. Amen.